Hello, welcome to our Belgian Virtual Camp 2021. And each day we're going to have a Bible focus on the three themes of wind, water, and fire. And we trust we'll hear God speaking to us through these elements as we talk about them. So from the three elements that we'll be looking at, wind, water, and fire, let's begin by looking at the wind and how God's voice was heard in the wind. Our text for this Bible focus comes from the book of Job, chapter 38 and verse 1, where we read that the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. The five men, who are the characters in the book of Job, the human characters at least, had been in conversation with each other, various cycles of conversation. But finally, God speaks. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. So it's the voice of God coming from the wind. You know, we can think of another time recorded in 1 Kings chapter 19 and concerning the prophet Elijah. And we read there that in his time the Lord had not been in the wind. But when we come to the book of Job and God's servant Job, it certainly was the case here that God was in the wind and God's voice was heard speaking to Job from out of the whirlwind. The Bible book of Job presents to us the classic story of human suffering. Job's experience of suffering and trial and loss had been, as it were, a great storm in his life. But God used it to speak to his servant Job through that storm, as well as speaking to him out of the actual, literal storm that we find at the end of the book. You know, when bad things happen to us in life, it's natural to ask, why me? But in the case of Job, no answer to that question is ever shared with this man. But rather, at the end of the book, Job says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. In other words, through his experience, he had gained a greater sense of God. You know, stormy winds are not good in themselves. They can do a lot of devastating damage, but they can be used for good by God. Maybe it's a little like a trip to the dentist. Perhaps that in itself is not good, but hopefully the result, the relief, is good. And so at the end of the book of Job, God doesn't give him an answer, doesn't even give him an explanation. But he says to Job, trust me. I'm in control. And Job experienced after that the goodness of God. Job, in his experience of suffering, had wanted to question God. And at the end of this book, God takes Job on a tour of creation. He shows him all the wonderful things that he has made, the stars, the different animals, the natural processes. It's as if he's saying to Job, if you want to question my wisdom in what I've been doing in your life, first tell me if you understand my wisdom in all the other things that I am doing in the world. God with us, when we suffer and have our doubts perhaps, God with us doesn't turn our eye to creation. but he can turn our eye to the cross of Calvary and show us his wonderful design of salvation. And when we are reminded of what God has done for us through his Son at the cross, we can only trust him in whatever he allows in our lives, because his care for us is beyond doubting when we think of the cross. Storms in life, like the one experienced by Job, can make people either bitter or better. As an example, in our lands, when storms occur in people's lives, very often they would question God's care for them, or even question God's existence at all. But in other lands, typically poorer lands, less developed countries, the even more desperate storms that people experience there, sometimes quite literal storms, very often shape and deepen their sense of dependence upon God. Let's finish our little focus on wind by thinking about the words of Christian author Lewis, when he said that God speaks to us in whispers in our pleasures, and he shouts to us in our pain. When someone shouts, they are grabbing our attention. They are reminding us of their presence. And that reminder of presence can be comforting and supportive. And so we've shared the idea of wind and God's voice speaking to us in the storms of our lives.